This is my true story. I worked my whole life to build a home for my family. I thought it would always be a place of love and respect. But instead, the people I raised began to see me as a burden. One night, my own son told me I was useless and ordered me to clean the toilets. They laughed as I scrubbed. My heart broke, but my mind stayed quiet. Because what they didn't know was that house was still in my name, and I already knew what I was going to do next. And you won't believe what I did, but before that tell me, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? And please subscribe so more people can hear my story. I worked with my hands all my life. From the time I was a young man until the day I retired, I never knew rest. I built houses for other people, worked long shifts on construction sites, and even took night jobs just to put food on the table. Every nail I hammered, every wall I lifted, I did it with the thought that one day my own family would live safe and secure in a home I provided. I saved every dollar I could. I skipped small pleasures like vacations or new clothes because I had a bigger dream, a house that would belong to my blood, something they could always depend on. And in time, I bought that house with my own sweat. I signed every paper, I paid every debt, and I held that deed in my hands, knowing it was the result of a lifetime of sacrifice. To me, the house was never just walls and a roof. It was my heart. It was the place where my wife and I raised our children. It was where birthdays were celebrated, where the smell of her cooking filled every corner, where I sat at the table after long days feeling proud that at least I could give my family safety. I kept that house standing strong, fixing the pipes, replacing the shingles, painting the walls. When the kids wanted to bring friends over, I welcomed them. When neighbors needed a place to stay for a night, I opened the door. That house was a symbol of unity, of kindness, of family. As the years passed, my children grew older. Life was not easy for them, and I never turned my back when they stumbled. When jobs were lost, when debts piled up, when they couldn't pay rent, I invited them back into the very home I had built. I said, "This house is not just mine, it is ours. As long as I live, you will always have a roof." I believed those words with all my heart. I thought by sharing the home, by letting them live without rent, without worry, they would see it as a gift. I believed respect would be given in return. I even welcomed my grandchildren. I wanted them to know what it meant to have family. I gave them my time, my stories, my patience. I thought surely, when they grew up, they would remember their grandfather not just as an old man, but as the builder of the place where they felt safe and loved. But with time, the respect I expected never came. They began to forget who gave them this roof. They began to see the house not as my sacrifice, but as their right. They forgot the years I worked with broken hands and aching bones. They forgot the nights I went hungry just to make sure they had enough. They forgot everything, and all I was left with were memories. Still, even in my old age, I loved that house. I walked through every room remembering the laughter, the warmth, and the life it once held. I told myself it would remain the family's heart even when I was gone. That was my mistake. I believed too much in their gratitude. I believed too much in the idea of family. Because one day, that house, the very home I built, would no longer feel like mine. It would become the place where I was no longer respected, no longer loved, and no longer wanted. At first, the changes were small, almost easy to ignore. My family spoke to me differently than they once had. When I gave advice, they didn't listen. When I shared stories, they rolled their eyes. My voice, once respected as the head of the home, was now treated like background noise. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe they were busy or stressed. But deep down, I felt the shift. The home I had built, where my word once meant something, was starting to feel like a place where I no longer mattered. I noticed it at the dinner table. I would start to speak, maybe about the day or about the old times, and someone would cut me off. "Not now, Dad," my son would say, his eyes fixed on his phone. Or my daughter-in-law would sigh loudly, as though hearing my voice was a burden. Even my grandchildren, young and innocent, began to copy their parents. When I asked for help carrying something or moving a chair, they would mimic the same tone. "Grandpa, not now." Those words pierced me more deeply than they knew. Children repeat what they hear, and what they were hearing was that their grandfather was not worth their time. Then came the laughter. At first it was small, behind my back. I'd hear them whispering, then chuckling softly. I brushed it off, thinking I was imagining it. But soon, it became clearer. I'd drop something, and instead of helping me, they would laugh. I'd walk slowly across the room with my cane, and I'd hear them mutter, "Look at him," like a turtle. These weren't jokes shared in love. They were words soaked in disrespect. One evening, when I tried to remind them to turn off the lights in empty rooms, something I'd always done to save money, my son snapped at me. "Why don't you mind your own business? You don't pay for anything anymore." The words hit me like a slap. Because the truth was, I did pay for everything. The house was mine. The electricity bill was still in my name. The food they ate, I had paid for it with decades of labor. But in their eyes, I was already an old man living off them, not the provider who gave them everything. The worst part was not the words themselves, but the silence that followed. No one defended me, not my son, not my daughter-in-law, not even the grandchildren I loved so dearly. They all just sat there, letting the disrespect hang in the air like it was normal. That silence cut deeper than any insult. At night, when I went to my room, I would sit on the bed and stare at the walls. These walls I had painted myself. These floors I had built with my own hands. I remembered the years I carried cement bags, the nights I worked overtime, the mornings I came home too tired to eat. I gave everything to make this house a home. And now, inside these same walls, I was treated like a stranger. Still, I stayed silent. I told myself maybe it was just stress. Maybe it would pass. Maybe tomorrow they would treat me better. But tomorrow never came. Each day brought a little less respect, a little more mockery, and a little more pain. That was the beginning. The small cracks that showed me my family no longer saw me as the man who built their home. To them, I was just an old body taking up space. And as those cracks widened, what little dignity I still held in that house began to slip away. It didn't take long for the small cracks of disrespect to grow into open wounds. What began as whispers and quiet laughter turned into direct words, spoken to my face without hesitation or shame. One evening, while everyone was gathered in the living room, my son looked at me and said plainly, "You're useless." Just like that. No hesitation, no care for how deeply it might cut. His words hung in the air like a knife, sharp and cruel. I froze, unsure how to respond. My whole body went cold, as though I had been struck. My daughter-in-law smirked, and the grandchildren laughed, not even knowing the weight of what they were repeating. "Useless," they said, copying their father's tone, as if it were a game. They didn't understand they were piercing my soul. My son went on. He said I was just an old man waiting to die, and that I was taking up space. He laughed at the way I shuffled when I walked, mocked the way my hands shook when I held a cup, and told me to stop telling stories because, in his words, nobody cares about your past. It's boring. Each word stripped away the little dignity I had left. I felt like I was shrinking in my own home, a place I had built with my own blood, sweat, and broken bones. I wanted to remind him of everything I had sacrificed. I wanted to shout about the nights I worked late just to make sure he had food in his mouth. I wanted to tell him about the cold winters when I wore the same coat for years so I could buy him new shoes for school. But the words caught in my throat. I realized that no amount of reminding would change his heart. Respect cannot be begged for. It must be given freely. What hurt the most wasn't the insults themselves, but the laughter that followed. My grandchildren giggled as if their father's cruelty was entertainment. My daughter-in-law looked at me as though I were nothing but an inconvenience she was forced to tolerate. I sat there quietly, my face calm, but inside, my heart was breaking into pieces. Later that night, alone in my room, I cried quietly, where no one could hear me. I thought about how far we had fallen as a family. Once, I was the strong pillar that everyone leaned on. I was the one who fixed broken chairs, paid overdue bills, and guided them through hard times. Now, in their eyes, I was nothing but a weak, slow, and useless man. I began to wonder if they had ever truly loved me, or if their love had always been tied to what I could provide. Now that my hands were too weak to carry heavy loads, now that my legs were too slow to run for them, now that my money was no longer being spent on their daily needs, maybe in their eyes, I had no value. But as painful as those nights were, something else was happening deep inside me. The insults no longer only hurt, they also planted a quiet anger. An anger that grew stronger each time I heard their mocking voices. An anger that told me, this cannot go on. They thought they had broken me with their cruel words. What they didn't know was that every insult was building my resolve. Every laugh was fueling my determination. Every cruel reminder that I was useless was shaping the plan I would one day use to show them just how wrong they were. That was the night I promised myself. The man they called useless would be the one to take away everything they thought was theirs. If the insults had not already broken me, what happened next pushed me into the deepest pit of humiliation. One evening, after another round of their mocking laughter, my son looked at me and said in front of everyone, "At least do something useful for once. Go clean the toilets." His words hit me like a slap. For a moment, I thought maybe he was joking, but his face stayed hard and the others didn't protest. My daughter-in-law smirked as if the command amused her. The grandchildren burst out laughing, pointing at me like I was a clown. I stood frozen, ashamed and silent, but my son raised his voice louder. "Did you hear me? Clean the toilets. That's the only thing you're good for now." I wanted to fight back. I wanted to remind him that those toilets, that roof, those very walls, they existed only because I built them. But my voice caught in my throat. I looked at the faces of my family, the very people who should have defended me, and all I saw was indifference. No one stopped him. No one said, "That's too far." Instead, they all turned away, letting the humiliation sink in deeper. With slow steps, I walked toward the bathroom. Every step felt like a heavy stone tied to my chest. My hands trembled as I picked up the brush and the bucket. My back ached as I bent over the toilet, scrubbing quietly while their laughter carried through the walls. Each sound from the living room was a reminder. They no longer saw me as a father, a grandfather, or even a man. They saw me as nothing more than a servant. The smell of bleach filled my nose, stinging my eyes, but it was the shame that truly burned. My mind replayed the years when I worked 12-hour shifts, my hands blistered and raw, just to make sure my children had food and clothes. I remembered skipping meals so my son could eat. I remembered working weekends so he could go to college. I remembered paying for his wedding, handing him the keys to the house he now claimed as his own. And now, the same son stood in the next room laughing while I scrubbed the toilets like a maid. I kept scrubbing, my heart heavy, but something inside me began to shift. As I knelt there on the bathroom floor, a thought hit me. I was the one who had allowed this. I had given them everything without boundaries. I had taught them to take without teaching them to respect. And now they believed I was powerless. But I wasn't powerless. The house they lived in, the house they treated as their own, was still legally mine. Every brick, every window, every piece of land was in my name. They might have mocked me as useless, but on paper, I was still the one holding the power. They laughed at me with bleach on my hands, but I smiled bitterly inside, realizing something important. The man they thought was powerless still had the strength to destroy everything they took for granted. As I finished scrubbing, I looked at my wrinkled hands. To them, those hands were weak, shaking, and incapable. But those same hands had built this home, had signed every document, and could just as easily sign it all away. That night, as I lay in bed, their laughter still echoing in my ears, I didn't cry. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel broken. Instead, I felt calm, sharp, and cold. The shame they had forced on me had turned into fuel. They had given me my answer. They thought I was useless. Soon, they would see just how dangerous useless could be. Lying awake that night, the smell of bleach still clinging to my fingers, I kept replaying the humiliation in my mind. My son's sneer, my daughter-in-law's smirk, the children's laughter. It all echoed in my head like a cruel song. They had called me useless. They had forced me onto my knees to scrub toilets in the house I had built with my own 2 hands. But as I stared at the ceiling in silence, another truth pushed its way into my thoughts, stronger than the sting of their insults. The truth was this: the house wasn't theirs. Not a single wall, not a single tile, not a single brick. Every inch of it still belonged to me. On paper, in the eyes of the law, the title of that home was under my name, and mine alone. Years ago, I had thought about transferring it officially to my son, but something inside me had stopped me. Maybe it was caution, maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the voice of my late wife whispering from somewhere beyond, warning me not to give up everything. So instead of handing it over, I had simply let them live in it, rent-free, while keeping the documents tucked away in a safe place. For years, they had assumed ownership. They walked through those rooms as if they were kings and queens. They called it their house, showing it off to friends and neighbors, speaking proudly as if they had earned it. They forgot, or perhaps they never even knew, that the only reason they could live so comfortably was because I had given them that gift. And now, they had forgotten something even more important. Gifts can be taken back. As I thought about it, a strange calm washed over me. My humiliation earlier that evening was no longer just pain. It was clarity. They had crossed the line. They had mocked me, degraded me, treated me like a servant in the home I had built. But the law was not on their side. The law was on mine. I thought about all the years I had worked to build that house. I remembered every nail hammered into the wood, every hour of overtime I had sweated through just to pay for the materials. I remembered the nights when my wife and I ate plain bread so that every paycheck could go toward keeping the roof above us. That house was more than a building. It was my blood, my sacrifice, my life's work. And now, it was the very weapon I would use to reclaim my dignity. I also thought about the arrogance of my son and his wife. They never once questioned the paperwork. They never once asked whose name was on the deed. In their minds, it was already theirs, as if my existence no longer mattered. They believed the old man who sat in the corner of the living room was powerless. They believed the man scrubbing the toilets was weak. They believed the father they mocked was too broken to stand up for himself. They were wrong, because while they laughed, I still held the one thing they could never take from me without my consent: control, the title deed, the ownership, the final say over the home they thought was theirs. That night, as I turned onto my side and closed my eyes, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a man with a secret weapon. The papers tucked away in my locked drawer upstairs were more powerful than their insults, stronger than their laughter, and sharper than any words I could throw back at them. For the first time in years, I allowed myself a smile. It wasn't a warm smile, not the kind a father gives when he's proud of his children. It was a cold smile, the kind a man wears when he knows justice is finally within his hands. They thought I was helpless. They thought I was trapped. But the truth was simple. The house was mine. And soon, they would learn the cost of forgetting that truth. When the morning came, I didn't wake up broken. I didn't wake up as the useless old man they thought I was. I woke up with a plan. The sunlight slipping through the curtains felt different that day. Not warm, but sharp, like a blade. My body was tired, my hands ached, but inside me was a strength I hadn't felt in years. Their cruelty the night before had flipped a switch. I was done being their servant. I was done swallowing humiliation. I moved slowly, careful not to alert anyone. The house was quiet. They had all left for work and school. My son kissed his wife on the cheek as he left, not knowing his whole world was about to change. I watched him go from the upstairs window, and I felt no anger anymore, only resolve. I went to my desk in my locked room. Inside the bottom drawer, under some old letters from my wife, was a metal box. In that box lay the deed to the house. My fingers trembled as I pulled it out, not from weakness, but from the weight of what I was about to do. The paper was old, edges yellowed, but the ink was clear. My name, bold and unchallenged. It was proof that no matter how much they mocked me, I was still the master of this home. I picked up the phone and dialed my lawyer, an old friend who had helped me with paperwork for years. He answered quickly, his voice steady and familiar. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," I replied. "I'm ready to make some changes." I explained everything. I told him how my family had treated me, how they had stripped me of dignity under the very roof I gave them. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. He had seen enough of life to understand cruelty when he heard it. Finally, he said, "Bring the deed. We'll transfer ownership immediately. Do you want it in your name alone or in trust?" "In trust," I said. "Something they can't touch. Something permanent." That was the heart of my plan. I wouldn't just remind them who owned the house. I would erase their imagined ownership completely. No loopholes, no arguments, no hope of getting it back. I would move the house into a trust under my name, and they would be nothing more than guests. Guests who could be removed at any time. The rest of the morning, I packed what I needed into a small bag: papers, identification, medicine. As I folded each item, I thought of every insult, every laugh at my expense, every cruel word they had tossed at me as though I were dirt. Each memory hardened my resolve. I locked my bag, straightened my back, and took one last look at the family photos on the wall. I saw my son as a boy, grinning with missing teeth. I saw my wife holding him proudly, her eyes full of hope. I saw birthdays, weddings, holidays, all moments when I believed this house would always be filled with respect. But those smiles had turned to sneers. That pride had turned to shame. Those memories were now ghosts, and I was tired of living with ghosts. I walked out, locking the door behind me. The air outside was crisp, and for the first time in months, I felt free. I carried the deed under my arm, and each step toward my lawyer's office felt like stepping toward justice. My plan wasn't about shouting or arguing. I wasn't going to confront them with words they would twist, mock, and ignore. My plan was to use silence and signatures, the two things they could never undo. They would come home from work expecting to relax in their house. Instead, they would find legal notices, eviction orders, and the crushing realization that they had lost everything they thought belonged to them. And the best part of the plan? They wouldn't even see it coming. The lawyer's office smelled of polished wood and old books. I had been there many times in the past to handle little things, tax questions, small documents, and once the writing of my will. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't a tired old man asking for help. I was a man carrying justice under his arm, folded into one fragile sheet of paper: the house deed. I handed it to him without a word. He read it carefully, his glasses sliding down his nose. When he looked back up, there was no hesitation in his eyes. He knew why I was there. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "More certain than I've been about anything in my life," I said. He nodded and set the deed on his desk. The sound of paper against wood was louder than thunder in my ears. With that one motion, I felt the weight of years of humiliation lifting. He opened a folder and pulled out the trust papers. "We'll put everything into a private trust under your name," he explained. "That way, they can never contest it. No transfer, no loopholes. You alone will decide who lives there and who doesn't." I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking under my old bones. I thought of the night before, when my son had sneered and told me to at least do something useful while handing me a toilet brush. I thought of the laughter echoing down the hallway as I scrubbed, my knees aching, my dignity dissolving with every stroke. That laughter had brought me here. That laughter was about to cost them everything. The lawyer slid the papers toward me. Sign here, and here. My hand shook slightly as I picked up the pen. Not from weakness, from the gravity of the moment. This was the hand that once held my son when he was a baby. The hand that worked decades to build this house, brick by brick, penny by penny. And now, it was the hand that would take it all back. The pen scratched across the paper. First signature, second signature, third. Each stroke felt like a hammer driving nails into the coffin of their arrogance. The lawyer stamped the papers, the heavy seal pressing into the page. That sound, that firm thud, was the sound of finality, the sound of everything changing forever. Done, he said. The house is now legally in trust. You are the sole controller. They have no rights, no claims. If you wish, I can prepare eviction notices immediately. I exhaled slowly. It was not relief I felt, but justice, cold, sharp, and undeniable. Do it, I said. As he prepared the documents, my mind drifted. I pictured their faces when they came home and saw the notices. My son, always so arrogant, always so sure that the house was his by birthright, would crumble. My daughter-in-law, who smirked when he mocked me, would finally taste silence. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was nothing but an old man with weak hands. But the power was always mine. The lawyer returned with the eviction notices in a neat stack. They'll be served tomorrow, he said. They'll have 30 days to vacate, unless you want to shorten the notice period. 30 days is enough, I replied. Let them feel the fear of the calendar. Let them count down each day, knowing the ground under their feet isn't theirs. I gathered my things, tucking the stamped documents carefully into my bag. When I stood up, my back didn't feel as bent as before. My legs didn't feel as heavy. For the first time in years, I walked out of that office not as a burden, but as a man who had reclaimed his dignity. Outside, the sun was shining. People passed me by on the street, not knowing that I had just changed the fate of an entire household with a few strokes of a pen. They saw an old man walking slowly. They didn't see the storm I had unleashed. As I waited for the taxi, I thought again of the words my son had thrown at me. Useless. He thought I was weak. He thought I was too old to fight back. But what he forgot is that silence can be sharper than shouting, and a pen can be stronger than fists. That day, the paperwork became my weapon, and with it, I had struck the first blow. When I returned home from the lawyer's office, the house looked the same as it always did. The windows glowing with light, the sound of laughter drifting faintly through the walls, the smell of food still hanging in the air. To anyone else, it was just a family home, alive and comfortable. But to me, it was a stage where I had been humiliated again and again. Every corner held a memory of insult. The dining table where they called me useless, the hallway where they laughed at my slow steps, the bathroom where I scrubbed toilets while they mocked me. I stood quietly in the driveway for a long moment, looking at the house I had built with my own hands decades ago. Brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, I had poured my youth and sweat into this place. And now I had taken it back. They didn't know it yet, but their laughter, their arrogance, their mockery, all of it would echo differently very soon. Inside, the family was busy. My son and his wife were talking loudly about weekend plans. The children were running up and down the hallway. Not one of them noticed me when I walked past with my slow, deliberate steps. Not one of them cared enough to ask where I had been or what I carried in the bag on my shoulder. I went into my room and closed the door quietly behind me. The walls of my room were bare, just a bed, a chair, and a small table. It no longer felt like my space, just a corner of the house where they let me exist. But I had no plans to stay much longer. I opened the old wooden wardrobe and pulled out a single suitcase. It had traveled with me many years ago when I was still young and chasing work from town to town. It had held my clothes back then, my tools, and my hopes. Now it would hold only the essentials: my medicine, a few clothes, and the documents the lawyer had given me. I packed carefully, folding each shirt with slow precision. Every sound in the house seemed louder as I worked: the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the laughter of children, the footsteps of my son upstairs. They thought life was normal. They thought the old man in the back room was defeated, harmless. They had no idea that while they were laughing, I had already removed the ground beneath their feet. When the suitcase was ready, I sat down on the bed for a moment. My heart was steady, but heavy. This wasn't just leaving a house. It was leaving behind years of sacrifice, years of dreams, years of believing that family meant loyalty and love. But they had broken that illusion the night they handed me a toilet brush and laughed at my humiliation. I stood up, picked up the suitcase, and opened the drawer of the small table. Inside was a pen and an envelope. I pulled out a sheet of paper and wrote only 2 words: "Goodbye forever." Nothing more. No explanations. No justifications. They didn't deserve my words, only my silence. I slipped the note into the envelope, placed it on the chair by the window, and walked out of the room. The hallway was quiet now. Most of them had gone upstairs, busy with their lives. I moved slowly, one hand on the suitcase, one hand steadying myself against the wall. My steps were soft, almost like a shadow passing through the house. At the front door, I paused. I looked back once, not at the people, but at the house itself. The walls, the roof, the floors, everything built by me. They thought it was theirs. They thought I was just a guest. But in truth, I was the master of this place, and I had chosen to take it away. I opened the door and stepped into the night air. It was cool, quiet, and freeing. The weight of humiliation lifted with every step I took away from that house. The streetlights glowed faintly, and the road stretched ahead, empty but full of promise. At the corner of the street, a taxi waited, the same one I had arranged earlier. The driver got out and helped me place my suitcase in the trunk. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. I climbed into the back seat, leaned my head against the window, and watched the house disappear as the car pulled away. Inside, they still laughed, still talked, still believed life would go on as usual. But in my silence, I had already ended that illusion. Tomorrow, the eviction notices would arrive. Tomorrow, they would learn the truth. For the first time in years, I felt light. No shouting, no confrontation, no begging for respect. Just quiet, deliberate action. My departure was not a retreat. It was the sharpest revenge. As the taxi drove through the night, I closed my eyes. For once, the silence wasn't heavy with humiliation. It was full of dignity, and I knew I had finally reclaimed what was always mine. When the morning came, the house was loud as usual. My son woke up complaining about work. My daughter-in-law shouted at the children to get ready for school, and the whole place buzzed with their usual noise. They had no idea that while they slept peacefully under the roof I had built, I was already gone. No one knocked on my door. No one checked if I was there. To them, I was invisible unless they needed a chore done. It didn't take long for the first shock to hit. A knock at the door around midday startled them. Not a neighbor, not a friend, but a courier carrying an official envelope. Inside were the eviction notices. The trust I had created with my lawyer had filed the paperwork immediately, and the documents were stamped and binding. The house, the land, the very walls they thought belonged to them were no longer theirs to claim. My son opened the letter, expecting bills or advertisements. Instead, he read the first lines out loud, his voice stumbling. "This property is no longer under your legal ownership. You are required to vacate within 30 days. His wife froze. The children looked confused, and for the first time, the noisy house turned silent. He ran to my room, flung the door open, and found nothing but an empty bed, an open wardrobe, and the envelope I had left behind with only 2 words: "Goodbye forever." He crumpled the paper in his fist, his face turning red with a mix of anger and fear. My daughter-in-law shouted at him, demanding answers. The children whispered to each other, realizing that Grandpa wasn't coming back. The phone calls began almost instantly. My number lit up again and again, but I didn't answer. Voicemail after voicemail filled with anger, then panic, then desperation. "Dad, what have you done? You can't just leave. You can't just take the house." Another call. "This isn't fair. We live here too. You owe us." And then, softer, almost trembling, "Please, Dad, what are we supposed to do now?" But my silence was stronger than any reply. The following days were chaos for them. Neighbors started to notice. Word spread quickly when the eviction notices were posted on the door. People whispered in the street, "Did you hear? The old man still owned the house. Now they're losing it." The same neighbors who once saw me scrubbing the garden path or dragging trash bins alone now looked at my family with judgment in their eyes. The arrogance that had filled my son's chest collapsed into shame. He went to the lawyer's office, trying to reverse it, but the documents were clear. The house was held in a trust I alone controlled. His name, his wife's name, even his children's names meant nothing. They were squatters now, not owners. Every penny of their comfort had rested on an assumption, and I had taken that assumption away with a single signature. Anger turned into desperation. He begged his boss at work for an advance, tried calling banks for loans, even asked his in-laws for help. But the numbers were too high. The mortgage-free home they thought was their greatest asset was never theirs. Without it, they had nothing. At night, my daughter-in-law wept, blaming him for not securing the house legally years ago. "You let your father keep control. You thought he was weak, but he was smarter than both of us," she shouted. Their marriage, once loud with arrogance, now cracked under the weight of fear. And the children. I thought of them often. They didn't laugh as freely anymore. They whispered in hushed tones, asking where Grandpa went, asking why they had to leave the only home they knew. My heart ached for them, but I knew it wasn't my place to fix it anymore. Their parents had taught them to mock me, to laugh when I was humiliated. Now they were learning a new lesson. That disrespect carries consequences. Each call from my son became shorter, more frantic. One voicemail, his voice hoarse. "Dad, please. You win, all right? You proved your point. Just give us another chance." Another, quieter. "The kids don't understand. They keep asking why you hate us. Please, Dad, please come back." But still, I stayed silent. The day finally came when strangers arrived at the house, men in suits, with papers in hand. They weren't cruel, just professional. They gave my son and his family the final deadline to leave. Watching from the shadows, unseen by them, I saw my son's shoulders slump as he signed the acknowledgement. The man who once laughed while I scrubbed his toilets now stood powerless, signing his own surrender. Furniture was dragged out. Boxes were packed hastily. The once proud family who mocked me now looked like refugees on their own front lawn. Neighbors stood at their windows, watching the spectacle, whispering. Some shook their heads, others smirked. My son couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The humiliation I had endured in silence had finally turned back on them, multiplied. And me? I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even triumphant. I was calm. I had done what needed to be done. I had reminded them that respect is not optional. They had treated me as useless in the very house I built. Now they had no house at all. When I left that house, I carried only a small suitcase. Clothes, medicine, and the deed papers were inside. That was all I needed. I did not carry the insults, the laughter, or the humiliation with me. I left those behind with the people who threw them at me. As the bus rolled away from the street I once called home, I looked out the window for one last time. I didn't feel sorrow. I didn't feel guilt. I felt free. I moved to a quiet apartment in the countryside, far from their chaos. It is small, but it is mine. The rent is paid from the trust they cannot touch. Every chair, every plate, every wall belongs to me. No one calls me useless here. No one orders me to scrub toilets. I eat when I want, I sleep when I want, and I walk through my front door with dignity. I am no longer invisible. I am no longer a servant in the house I built. In the mornings, I wake to silence, not to shouting or insults. I make my own breakfast slowly, the way I like it. Bread toasted golden, tea brewed strong. I sit by the window, watching the sun climb over the fields. Sometimes neighbors greet me with a smile as they pass, and I greet them back. To them, I am simply Mr. Old Man. Not a burden, not a joke, just a person living his life. And that is all I ever wanted. I spend afternoons walking in the garden near my apartment. My knees hurt sometimes, but I walk proudly, at my own pace. No one tells me I am slow. No one sighs in impatience. I sit on the bench, watching children play. Some of them wave at me, and I wave back. Their laughter heals the cracks in my heart, where my family's cruelty once lived. Sometimes I think of my son. I picture him standing outside that house, boxes piled high, neighbors whispering about his downfall. I wonder if he finally understood. Respect is not given because of blood. It must be earned every day, with kindness. He had a father who gave him everything, a roof, a home, a legacy. But he chose mockery instead of gratitude, cruelty instead of care. And so, he lost it all. Do I regret it? Number. I regret only that it took me so long to act. For years, I stayed silent, swallowing insult after insult, hoping things would change. But silence did not bring respect. Action did. The moment I took the deed back into my own hands, I also took back my dignity. Now, when I lie down at night, I sleep peacefully. No laughter echoes through the walls. No cruel voices tell me I am worthless. Only quiet. Only rest. Only freedom. I sometimes write letters to my grandchildren, not to blame them, not to remind them of the past, but to teach them what respect means. Maybe one day they will read my words and understand why things ended the way they did. Maybe they will grow kinder, wiser, and if they do, then my decision was not only for me, but for them too. My story is not about revenge alone. It is about reclaiming dignity. It is about showing that no matter how old, how weak, or how mocked you are never powerless. As long as you have your will, your mind, and your courage, you can stand up, even if it means walking away. Final thought. They called me useless in the house I built. Now they have no house at all, and I have peace.